Gonna go ahead. Okay. The League of Women Voters has been around for 102 years now, and we intend to be here for 102 more because we're needed more than ever, empowering voters and fighting for democracy, which is sadly more threatened than it's ever been. But tonight, I would like to introduce our speaker, Lisa Forbes. Lisa is a former member of the LWVCO board and still a member of the Adams County leadership. As the youngest of 6 children, Lisa grew up in a Chicago housing project where she endured sexual, religious, and emotional abuse as a little girl. A voracious reader, she graduated high school at 15 years old and went to work as a secretary in a downtown insurance office. She became pregnant at 16 and at 19, unexpectedly and uncharacteristically committed a violent act, stabbing and killing the father of her daughter, which resulted in a 14-year-long stint in a maximum security prison. And that resulted in her fierce resolve to understand the effects of the trauma she endured, to take personal responsibility for her actions, and to ensure that her history does not dictate her destiny. So please welcome Lisa Forbes.
Thank you. So we can just have an open conversation. If anyone has any questions or anything, Beth, people can just cut in. But I really just wanted to share my reasons for writing the book. It is a book about self-empowerment, but it is primarily also a book about trauma. And so when I first started writing the book, I wanted to write it for people who had had the experience of incarceration, to show them that there was a way to cut the chains of trauma that was causing them to be linked to their past. We have anywhere from a 60 to 70% recidivism rate nationally. And my argument is that a lot of that is rooted in trauma. If you can get people out and help them get apartments, help them get jobs. But the question is, can they keep it? Are they too traumatized to go forward with their life? Is trauma really dictating their decisions? So I wanted to write the book to show, some people have said that the last chapter of the book seems like it belongs in a different book. It's a lot of information about policies and things that should change. And actually, that was the book that I really wrote first. That was my manuscript. I had been listening to a lot of the conversations about recidivism and second chance initiatives and, the First Step Act, even under the Trump administration. And I kept feeling like there was an element that's missing out of this conversation. And the element is that you can't just let traumatized people out to go back to their traumatized families in their traumatized communities and expect them to do well. They will be right back if you don't address the root cause of why most of them are there in the first place. And there are many statistics, many studies that have shown that the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in the United States suffered from childhood trauma. And that is in addition to the trauma that they experience while they are incarcerated. So it is a really big deal to address trauma if you want to address recidivism. And recidivism is connected to so many things. It's connected to public safety. It's connected to public health. Many of the people who are incarcerated have children who are in foster care. They can't get their kids out because they can't get stable enough to have a job that pays enough to get them in the situation where the state requires them to be. So for instance, people don't know that if I am a single parent and I have a boy and a girl, and my children are in foster care, when I come home, if I've been incarcerated, I have to have a 3-bedroom apartment. Because none of the children can sleep with me, and the boy and the girl can't share a bedroom. So how do I afford a 3-bedroom apartment on a minimum wage job? So and then so that flows into the argument that I make in the book, that when people get out of prison and they go to places that want to get them jobs, a lot of times people say, oh, just, be glad that you got something, we helped you get this. No, we need to be coming into the system at the level at which we are actually qualified to work. We need to be able to earn the salary that we are actually qualified to make. People go to prison and they take every class there. They get every degree they can. They get every certificate they can. And they do that on the taxpayer's dime. They get Pell Grants for that. And then when we come out, nobody wants to hire us for the things we're qualified to do. So we wind up working at a minimum wage job, having totally wasted the degrees and the time and the money that we've spent earning it, and never being able to get our kids back, get an apartment. You wind up couch surfing or living with a parent when you're 40 with 3 kids. It really takes a toll on society as a whole to not understand all the different things that are at play in criminal justice and in incarcerations and in recidivism. And so what is the root of some of this recidivism? And that's why I was really pleased to have the president and CEO of the Society for Human Resource Management endorse the book. And on the back of the book, he said, that he had long been a supporter of second chance initiatives, but that reading my story actually made him rethink that maybe the root cause of some of this is trauma or emotional health. And so I wanted to share my own story when I wrote the book. Actually, when I first wrote the book, I didn't. So I wrote that last chapter and I presented it to my editor. And he was like, Lisa, this is a white paper. This is not this is not a book, right? He said, first of all, nobody knows who you are. So even if people are reading this and agreeing with you or want to agree with you, they still want to know, who are you to be talking about this? How do you know, right? So it really came down to that my authority to talk about it was my story. And so that to have any authority to talk about it, I was going to have to tell my story. I was going to have to share my experiences and let people know that when I'm talking about trauma, I'm speaking from personal experience. And I'm speaking about things that maybe a lot of people have not endured even a fraction of the different traumas that I've been through. I mean, I was hit by a car when I was 4. I've had all kinds of emotional abuse, religious abuse from the time I was, 5 years old. I was told my mother is in a religion that was just waiting for the end of the world. Her religion is divided into the sheep and the goats. The sheep are going to survive Armageddon and the goats are going to be killed by God. And I was classified as a goat because I was hard-headed and disobedient. Imagine being told that every day from the time when you're in 5th grade. Imagine being bullied in school and then come home and be sexually molested at home by a brother and, bullied at home and then 14 years of incarceration and all of these things. I tried to escape. I fell off the fence. That's a whole different story. Shattered my ankle. I had all kinds of physical injuries and then came home. And how this really gelled for me was that, so I was the youngest of 6 children growing up. And I was incarcerated for 14 years. I had been home for 9 months when I married a man who was my father's age and who had 5 children older than me. So I was immediately right back in my childhood, being the youngest of 6 children, married to somebody my parents' age. And it was down almost to the tiniest detail. It was a recreation of my childhood. He was just like my parents, and his children were just like my siblings. And at some point, that dawned on me how similar my marriage all these decades later was to my childhood. And that's when I realized I'm stuck in a loop. I'm not actually moving forward in anything. I'm just substituting people and places for the same situations. Somehow I've got to figure out what has me changed to this situation. And so that is also the key to recidivism. What has people changed to doing those things that take them right back to prison over and over again? I can tell you in the 14 years I was there, I saw the same people in and out, in and out, in and out. And it's not that people are want to be there or dumb, or some of them, it's not even that they don't even have family. Something else is chaining them to that repetitive pattern. And so I went online, and at that time, I was in Atlanta, and I had gotten laid off. I was working at a law firm, and they did commercial real estate. And so the bottom had dropped out of that. So I was laid off. I had filed for divorce. My husband at that time had moved out, and my home was in pre-foreclosure. So while I was waiting to be put out, I went online, and I just started searching for childhood trauma, repeating trauma. I didn't even really know what I was looking for, but I came up on a website by a man called Brad Yates. And he was doing something that he called tapping, or the emotional freedom technique. And it was really based on the Chinese acupuncture system. But instead of using needles, you just tap on specific points on the body, and you just start talking about the things that are generating a charge for you. Now, so I didn't have any idea how to get started, but he has a workbook. And so there are scripts that you can start off with. And as you start with these scripts, then you realize that at some point you don't need the script, because you start talking about your own life. But I started with using the technique and working on a script called "I Have These Really Old Hurts," and just tapping on this script in these different places that I describe in the book, or you can look online for tapping demonstrations. And I realized as I started doing it that almost immediately I could tell something was happening. But as I kept doing it over weeks and months, and I did it every day, I noticed that I started feeling less charged. A lot of things came up, a lot of pain came up. I did a lot of crying, did a lot of screaming, had a lot of gastrointestinal issues, a lot of trauma and pain being released. But that's when I really knew that the technique worked. And why it was important for me to share it was because there are a lot of techniques, for helping people with psychological damage or emotional trauma. But I was in a situation where I knew a lot of, at least people who had been formerly incarcerated, but then other people as well could relate to. Whereas I didn't have any money to go talk to somebody. I didn't have any insurance. At that time, I didn't even have a car. So if I had needed to go anywhere, or have gas money, or put on some clothes and go talk to somebody to get help, I never would have gotten it. Why tapping was important to me to share was because I didn't need any of those things. I could sit in my raggedy clothes in my pre-foreclosure house by myself with no money, no insurance, and work this tapping protocol. And I knew that if it could help someone who had the level of trauma that I had, it would certainly be able to help anybody else who might have much less trauma. So when I wrote the book, I was writing for people who were incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. But as I began sharing the story with people started telling me their stories of trauma that had nothing to do with incarceration. And that's when I, began to put it together that trauma is trauma. And really, you can be in prison anywhere. There are people in prison in their homes, people in prison in their marriages, You know, people in all types of prison, people who have had all types of trauma. You may not have been to prison, but you may have had domestic violence. You know, you may have had some other form of childhood abuse. And so trauma is trauma. And so the story really began to expand as to who could possibly relate to this. I had a woman tell me a story how she's been really living in the shadows for years, running from an ex-husband who has promised to kill her whenever he finds her. You know, and so I wanted to share this protocol that is really so effective, and it's free, and it's so simple and easy to use. And I wanted to share my story so that people would believe that, you know, people say, oh yeah, that's fine, but what do you know? Well, this is what I know. You know, I know that from the really having been classified as the worst of the worst, if I was able to make a complete turnaround in my life, anybody else could do the same. And I didn't want to write a book that was just about celebrating me. You know, I've read lots of prison memoirs and I've loved them. But what I didn't see in them was how it really would help me next. So it made me happy for that person, but I didn't know how it applied to me. I wanted to write a book that when a person turned that last page, they would feel like if they could relate to that story, they could follow the steps that I followed. I wanted to show people that they could take it from wherever they are. You know, wherever your here is, you could take it from here. And these are the steps. And so Toni Morrison said, if there's a book you want to read that you haven't been able to find, then you must write it. And so that's why I wrote, I Can Take It From Here, because I wanted people to have not just hope, but a path that they could actually walk, a path that they could say, well, maybe I could do the exact same thing she did and get to the same point. And that was really my motive for writing the book. I wanted people to feel like they could do it too. And so, you know, when I really got the equivalent of a college education in prison. I graduated from high school when I was 15, but since my mother was waiting for Armageddon to start at any moment, she said that I didn't need any more worldly knowledge. So she took me to get a worker's permit, and I went to work downtown as a secretary. And I was 16 when I got on that job, and that's where I met my daughter's father. And a few months later, I was pregnant. And it was, you know, so that was it was the beginning of a series of events that ultimately just led to an emotional breakdown, was really what it was. When I really was careful, and I always am careful to tell people that when I tell the story of what led to my incarceration, I do not write this to try to justify myself. I don't write it to try to demonize other people or rationalize the crime. There really isn't any way to explain what happened except to put it in the context of of who I was at that time, the emotional state that I was in, and that what I really had was just a breakdown. And so I projected my entire life and all the pain of my entire life onto a single person in a single instant and just punished them for it. That was really what it was. I tell people all the time that if I had been on my jury and had heard only what they heard, I would have convicted me too. So I do understand, you know, why people don't understand, oh, how could a person do that? But there's a context that many times juries don't hear. There's a context that of how this came about. And when people say, well, why didn't you just leave? That you were at his house. Why didn't you just leave? All I can say is that in that moment, the only decision I could make was the decision that my traumatized mind would let me make. I couldn't make the rational decision that I can make now looking back. And so, you know, that when I tap on what happened on the crime, I don't tap on it to not feel bad about what happened, to justify what happened. I tap on it to make sure that what happened is not repeatable. That's the point of it. It can't be undone, you know, and so, you know, you have people in these situations, and did you do it? Yes. But the question is, can people be redeemed? You know, and what is that process so that people can be brought into the workforce safely, can be brought back into our neighborhoods safely, right? Can be reintegrated into society safely. And they've done the work that makes their, whatever they did, no more likely to be repeated than anyone else who was never incarcerated in the first place. And, you know, another thing that I share with people is this issue of violent offenders, violent criminals versus non-violent offenders. Something that I've really come to understand is that is a totally fictitious distinction. So it really just depends on what you were convicted of in that moment. So there are many people who are convicted of non-violent offenses who are very violent people. They just never got convicted or arrested for all the violence they've committed. So they're considered non-violent criminals or offenders. Meanwhile, you have people who I would consider myself one, who in a state of emotional breakdown committed a single violent act, but who might be inherently non-violent. And we have the permanent label of violent offender. When in fact, you know, I can't even watch horror movies. You know, I can't even, violence actually offends me. You know, the Michael Jackson video Thriller, I had nightmares for nights after watching that. It's so people don't really understand that some of these labels that people get are false. And when you bring people back into the workforce, into the community, and you say, oh, but they were convicted of a non-violent offense. That doesn't mean they're not a non-violent offender. That doesn't mean that they're not inherently violent. That's just referring to what they got arrested for. And so we really need to get to some of the root causes and the root, what's really at the heart of why people are in prison. What happened, and the fact that regardless of what happened, whether their crime was violent or not, 90% of people who are currently incarcerated will be out. 90% of people who are incarcerated will be out. I don't care if they've had a double homicide. 90% of people who are currently incarcerated will be out. So it's really important for society to figure out, who do we want these people to be when they inevitably get out? Is it in our best interest to let them sit there? Well, do time, you know, do the crime, do the time. That's fine, but they're still going to be out. Whether it's 20 years from now, it might not be you, but it'll be your kids. They'll be out one day. You know, as a society, what's our responsibility, not just to them, but to ourselves and to society, to figure out what can we actually do to break this link that keeps people reoffending, and to address the trauma that is really at the heart of a lot of what we call crime. It's really just, a lot of it is just traumatized people acting in traumatized ways. And so, and you know, a lot of time, I know that sometimes people have specific questions that they want to ask about the crime. And if you do, that's fine. I'm happy to answer anything specifically. But at the trial, I had a 5-day jury trial. I was on the witness stand for hours. It took the jury less than an hour to convict me. I had a public defender. He did not call a single witness on my behalf. I had a juror who slept through most of the trial. The judge instructed the bailiff more than once to wake up the juror. I mean, it was really just a sham of a trial. Not that I should not have been on trial, but what kind of trial was that? And so then when I filed my appeal, the appellate court acknowledged that a lot of things had gone wrong during my trial, but said, yeah, but the verdict probably should have been the same anyway. And so that's really still in that state of mind of having not addressed any trauma. That's when I said, okay, you know what? I'm just going to let myself out. These people are never going to let me out. There's a fence right there. I'm going to climb it. So I had, again, talking about just, emotional trauma. I had no plan. I was 90 miles from home. I had no idea what I was going to do once I got on the other side of that fence. I just knew I was going to get out. And so, people say, what were you thinking? What were you thinking when you did that? What were you thinking when you committed the crime? Here's another thing that a lot of people don't factor in when we look at who is incarcerated. We know that the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the judgment center, is not fully formed until a person is in their 20s. So when you have teenagers, and I was 19 when I committed my crime. So when you have people who are teen anything, legally grown, but if you're younger than your early 20s, that prefrontal cortex, that judgment center is not fully formed. And that is why you have a lot of people at that age, if they're not supported by their communities or their families or the schools, they're doing things that you're like, what's wrong with these people? Right? They don't, how do we even address this issue? We're looking at them as if they are people who even know why they're doing what they're doing. But you can't really know why you're doing what you're doing if that prefrontal cortex is not fully formed. And then if on top of not being fully formed, trauma impacts the prefrontal cortex. So you have people in whom that judgment center is still forming, being traumatized. So that cortex winds up smaller than it should have been, shaped differently than it should have been, not having the blood flow to it that it should have had. And you have people who just can't make the decisions that they would have made had they not experienced that trauma, had they not had their prefrontal cortex been fully formed, and had it not been injured. So there are a lot of things that go into who is committing crimes. What ages are they? How do we deal with them? Do we sentence people who are in their teens to life sentences? All of there are mental things that we know. There are physical things that we know that affect criminal behavior. We also know that nutrition affects the prefrontal cortex. People who are living on fast food, and feeding their kids fast food, with their brain scans that show that their brains are shaped differently. Areas of the brain are smaller in comparison to other parts of the brain than it is in a person who is well nourished and who has not experienced trauma. And so imagine how many crimes we could prevent in young people. We've got teenagers taking up rifles and going into grammar schools and shooting people. This doesn't just come out of a vacuum. We have to figure out why kids are doing this. What's happening in their brains? Not just in their emotional state, but also in their physical brain. How much of this crime could we prevent? Suicide is currently the #2 cause of death among teenagers. We have to figure out why this is happening. Younger and younger children committing suicide. And I know, as I tell in my story, that I can relate to that. I was suicidal throughout all of my childhood and my teens. When people say, why didn't you ever go through with it? I just say grace. But I could easily, I do know this, if I had had access to a gun, I probably would have shot everybody in my family. So I can actually relate to that. I can understand how this happens. And I really just wanted to start play a part in starting a national conversation. When we're talking about second chance initiatives and recidivism, let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about some of the things that are at the root of recidivism, at the root of crime in the first place, and how we can prevent some of these crimes. If my crime could have been prevented, if someone standing in front of me could have recognized how traumatized I was, how many crimes could we prevent if we could just get trauma awareness, trauma recognition on the table and in this conversation before it explodes into a crime that we can see, you know? And so really my goal in writing the book was just to share some of the experiences that I've had of trauma resolution, and then how I actually worked my way out of it, the exact processes that I used to get to the point to where, you know, if I didn't really tell you my story, you would never have guessed it. And that's the point that I want other people to be able to get to. But, you know, I talk to people and they say, you know, oh, I'm an ex-con. You don't have to, you know, they're never going to let me do this. I'm never going to be able to do that. And I want people to get to the point where they know that that's not true, that you can get to the point where you can be restored. And so I just, you know, briefly want to share that I refer to people who have been formerly incarcerated. People talk about returning citizens. I don't like that phrase. I get it. But to me, you know, I see people returning to society and returning right back to prison. So I didn't like the term returning. I use the term restored citizens. And I got that from the Bible. I read the Bible for the first time when I was incarcerated. And there's a scripture in it that says, God will restore to you the years that the local worm and the canker worm and the caterpillar had eaten up and devoured. And when I read that, I claimed that for myself. That was what I wanted. I wanted the years that had been stolen from me, the childhood that I had never had, the teenage carefree years that I had never had, the loving relationships that I had never had. I wanted those years restored to me. The 14 years of sitting in a cell, I wanted those years restored to me. I wanted to come out and be able to be the person I could have been had I not experienced so much unresolved trauma. So I started using the term restored for myself, and then it became just my vision of what I wanted other people to think of as themselves. Don't see yourself as somebody permanently damaged. See yourself as being able to be restored to the life and to the relationships that you are capable of having. And that's really why I wrote the book, just to start conversations with people about the missing element of trauma resolution in the criminal justice system.
Wow.
I know that was a lot, but
that was a lot, but really amazing. Thanks, Lisa. Peggy has a couple questions here. What are some of the warning signs of trauma? Is this part of mental health first aid?
You know, I like to separate it from mental health, as do many mental health professionals, because there is something that we don't want to start doing, which is blaming violent crime on the mentally ill. Because actually we know that mentally ill people are more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. So there is a distinction between mental health and what we're talking about with people who are just experiencing emotional trauma that is not resolved. So they really are distinct things, but there is a link, you know, to them as well. Even though the mentally ill are not more likely to commit a crime, people who are incarcerated are more likely to be mentally ill. So there's a nuance between that you have to kind of factor in there. But there really are all kinds of statistics that show that. I think the statistic is up to 80% of people who are incarcerated have some degree of emotional unwellness. If not mental health, if not a diagnosed psychiatric illness, but they have trauma. they're not emotionally well. And so there are actually signs that we can teach people to recognize that a person who is traumatized, actually, they hold their body different. There are ways that they hold their body. There are muscle patterns that get locked in a traumatized person in different parts of their body. People who are traumatized tend to speak differently. But many times you're so accustomed to talking to traumatized people that you don't know that certain things just become your norm. And we don't realize that we've never been taught this is what it would be like if a person was not traumatized, and this is what it would be like if they were, so that we could actually begin to see how many people in our environment actually are doing the traumatized thing. But there are actually things that you can look at, or things that I could share, where there are specific ways to look for how people hold their bodies, how people speak, how people use their eyes, where you can, because trauma is not just in the emotional state, it's also in the body. And there's a book, it's called The Body Keeps the Secrets. And it goes into the ways that when you don't express trauma verbally and you don't address it, your body starts speaking it for you. But the language of the body has to be recognized. And so if you don't recognize it, then so we have these people and we're just like, oh, what's wrong with them? I don't know what's wrong with them. But something is wrong with them. We just don't know what we're looking at.
Could you give one example of either body or speech pattern?
So one example that I've read is just a tendency to not have a connection, a good way of connecting cause and effect. Like people don't when people do things, like for instance, many times children who have, especially teenagers who are have been sexually abused, they will be acting out in sexual ways. And so we have, for instance, a society that's really normalizing that, and in a way that's not actually normal. It's not normal for kids in elementary school to be thinking of themselves in sexual ways, to be defining themselves with sexual labels, right? We have 5-year-olds now, saying, I'm gay. What are you talking about? How did you get exposed to this, to even that terminology? How do you know what gay is? We've sort of normalized a lot of things that are in fact traumatized behaviors, where children are, you can tell in their conversation that they're being exposed to something that really they are not capable of processing at the time. There's also, and so then they begin to act it out. Many people, there's even been some discussion even in my family of, well, if somebody is 13 years old and they're molesting their 8-year-old brother, did something possibly happen to them? How did they get to the point of doing that at 13? Because nothing really happens in a vacuum. So there are like choppy types of speech patterns, interest in things that are age inappropriate. Some of the physical manifestations are like, if you really have to be able to look at a child, but sometimes children walk their shoulders are very stiff. Their neck is very rigid. A lot of tension is held in the jaw and in the shoulders and the neck. And so when you have children who have like unusual pains in places, unusual stiffness, they don't have the normal flexibility, or they don't have the desire to play. They don't run around and play a lot. A lot of these are things like you just say, oh, that's just them. But there's a reason why they are that way. It's the tensions that get locked up in the body and in the muscles, and it's the tensing of the jaw affects speech patterns. And so there are a lot of different things that I can share with you, or you can look up that that show that how the trauma gets locked in specific areas of the body and then manifest, but you have to know how to interpret what you see.
But that's where the tapping comes in.
That's exactly right. So when you, part of the tapping program is to unlock those emotions that are trapped in the body, to unlock those places where trauma and stress and emotion has gotten into the body and just made you rigid, makes you prone to things like, for instance, one of the things that someone made me conscious of is the fact that I was just simply unable to walk out of a door without bumping my shoulder on the jamb. It was like I didn't know where my body was. Because one of the things that trauma does for a lot of people is it just makes you disconnect from your body. When something is happening to you and you have no control over it, especially when you're young, you just dissociate. And so you start to just not really be fully into your body, not have a really good concept of what your boundaries are, because nobody is respecting your boundaries. And so even when I first started practicing Aikido, the martial art, someone came behind me when I just could not figure out the movements. It was like I just could not move my arms the way they were telling me to. One of the instructors came behind me and said, "You don't know where your arms are." You know, it pulls you out of your body when you just seem to. Another thing that I used to have to deal with is I used to just trip for no reason. It was like I didn't know where my feet was, you know. And so I write in the book how I used to have a lot of like dream-like states. I would go into these states where I didn't really feel like things were real. And I would used to have a real problem with disassociation. And so that's one of the things that is generally recognized as being an effect of trauma, where you just disassociate and you're not fully in your body. So sometimes you see children and you just say, "Oh, they're clumsy." Maybe, or maybe something else is going on.
Lisa, where did you serve prison?
I was in Illinois at the time. And so I was in Dwight, Illinois. Dwight Correctional Center is about 90 miles outside of Chicago. And actually, Dwight is closed now, and they consolidated something because they, all of these places are having problems with not having enough correctional officers. Even here in Colorado, there's been stories lately about how they're having teachers and librarians come in and volunteer as guards because there aren't enough corrections officers. So, even as long as ago when I was incarcerated, that was a problem, and it's an even bigger problem now, which also then affects, things like programs, mental health programs, schooling programs. If they don't have enough staff for guards, they're not going to have enough staff for all these other things either. And so it really affects how people are not being prepared to come out and function well. And after 14 years, when I came home, I went to this place called the John Howard Association, and to help get a job. They, come in and say, "Oh, come and we'll help you get a job." When I went there, they told me, we're not allowed to help you because the Illinois Department of Corrections had put it on my parole papers that I needed therapy and that I was not fit to be in the workforce. And I said, "Okay, wait, because I've been sitting in the day room for 14 years. And so if you thought I needed therapy, why wouldn't you give it to me in all of those years? And why would you put it on my paperwork in such a way that prevents me from getting a job when I get out?" So it was really kind of like almost a setup. I was able to manipulate my way around some of that stuff, call people, get help, because I had enough literacy and I had written people and established relationships with people. But many people, the majority of people who are incarcerated, don't read at a 6th grade level. So you have a lot of illiteracy. So I felt like if I was having these problems, I could only imagine somebody who had a very low level of literacy. It's no wonder why they just turn around and go right back. Because all the hurdles that I had, I don't know what I would have done if I had not been able to read. And so I did spend a lot of time there volunteering. I got certified to teach English as a second language by the Volunteers of America. I taught math and I taught, help people get their GEDs, because I really saw the connection between illiteracy and incarceration. So there are a lot of things under the ground that are all tangled up that need to be addressed to deal with the criminal justice system and deal with recidivism. And we're just, to me, a lot of times we just look at what I call the leaves and the branches, nonviolent crime, federal offenders, drugs, whatever, let certain people out. This really is not the solution to resolving the situation in any kind of permanent way. It lets people out temporarily, but many of the people who got out under the First Step Act, many of them are already back. So it's really is about more than just opening the door and letting people out. If we want to resolve this situation and empower people, and I'm especially interested, in empowering women, because women are trying to raise children and all these, maybe some guys are too, obviously, but many of the women who are incarcerated were single mothers. And so it just affects generations when they can't get this issue resolved. And everybody pays the price. Taxpayers pay the price, employers pay the price who can't get decent people, qualified people to work. And yet here qualified people are sitting here, but you can't hire them because they can't pass the background check. People can't, homelessness is a part of this. Many people who are homeless are incarcerated, were incarcerated. But the other thing I like to make sure people understand is that many people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated are also veterans. People don't understand how many veterans are in the criminal justice system. They don't come home and get the help they need. And so they wind up on drugs or committing some kind of violent or non-violent act. And they wind up in the criminal justice system, and there's no justice for these people who have served their country. They get caught up in the criminal justice system and treated just like a criminal, when many times their trauma started when they were in Iraq or wherever else they were, and they come home and they get no help. Many incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people are veterans. And so there are just a lot of things that need to be looked at individually, but underlying all of it is like a thread of trauma. And let me just end with, I'm a Trekkie, all right, Star Trek. And so that one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation is called Tapestry. And so Captain Picard had this event, and I'm not going to go into this long story, but Captain Picard had this event where he got to see what his life would have been like had he not made some of the quote unquote mistakes in his childhood, who he would have become had he not made those mistakes. And what he found out that he would have become was just, a run-of-the-mill general average person in the military, as opposed to being the famed Captain Picard, because it was his having those experiences that brought into high relief who he wanted to be in life. And so when he was explaining to his first officer why he was grateful for the experience, he said, I thought that those were mistakes, but I realized that if I pulled at any one of those threads, I unraveled the whole tapestry of my life. And so that is how we can approach, first of all, being grateful for some of our experiences as opposed to being resentful about them. But it's also how we can approach the solution to some of this. Because to me, trauma is that thread that if you pull at it, you can unravel a lot of these issues that we approach individually. You can unravel homelessness if you pull at the thread of trauma. You can unravel recidivism. You can unravel a lot of these issues, a lot of teenage crime. If you resolve trauma, pull at that thread, a lot of these other issues will start to unravel, because connected by trauma. Traumatized people make traumatized choices. And so if you want people who are healthy enough to be good citizens and make better choices, you've got to unravel the thing that is keeping them from making those choices, from being able to make those choices. And that thread for many of us is trauma.
So how do we do that, Lisa?
Well,
I mean, you helped yourself,
mm-hmm.
which is amazing. But do you think that everyone has the capability of mm-hmm.
No. And so what I really am proposing, as I'm working with organizations and other policymakers on this issue and just trying to get into the place where I can, have some impact, is that it needs to be a systemic, it needs to be a social reform.
Mm-hmm.
As we address, many things dealing with, say, recidivism or criminal justice reform or, whatever, even domestic violence, all of these things need to have inherently as part of their resolution, trauma resolution. There are some things you just don't, you don't resolve one without the other. And so, while I'm not a big fan of saying the government is going to solve everything, there needs to be some statewide and even federal support for these things, but really it's going to be done on a community level. Organizations, need to be supported to include trauma resolution in anything that they're doing. Any of these first step acts or any of these programs, if you don't include trauma resolution in it, my position is that you're not going to get long-term results. And people can get out too. People can get out and never go back. But I'm not just talking about getting out and having, a life that is just, in the shadows or whatever. I'm talking about people being able to thrive. I'm talking about getting out and not having to spend the next 10 years on mom's couch. I'm talking about not having to spend the rest of your life in a minimum wage job. And so I'm talking about getting people to the point where they can get off of the government dole and carry their own weight and be able to be responsible for themselves and be responsible citizens. And that's what trauma resolution will help many people do who otherwise, even if they had the desire to do it, the disconnect between what you can mentally assent to as I should do it and what you're capable of doing. Sometimes that gulf is so wide that you just can't do what you know you should do, what you would like to do. And what is often occupying that space is trauma. You can't get off that treadmill. So you know what to do, but you can't do it. If we can resolve why you can't do it, and many times what's preventing you from doing it is trauma, we can get people to being able to do what they know to do. We talk to people sometimes like they don't know what to do. They know what to do. They don't know why they can't do it. Trauma resolution addresses that. Why can't you do what you know what to do? That was the issue for me. Once I could see that I was stuck in this loop, I still had to unravel the trauma that was keeping me in it. So we need organizations to work on it. We need, and those organizations need to be supported with funds.
Hey, we have a couple of questions here. Anne noted that you did not receive any psychological counseling while in prison. Are you aware of any changes in policies and practices more recently?
I am not, and in fact, if anything, from my studies, it's gotten worse because the staffing is less, the funding is less. Many of these prisons that they have gone down to just basic constant lockdown because they can't. And so what they call counseling really amounts to, and this was true even when I was there, what they call counseling amounts to going to a psychologist and getting a psychotropic drug. Everybody is just diagnosed as depressed. So here's some drugs. Well, I wonder why I'm depressed. This is not, all this drug is doing is making me sleep and slobber when I'm awake. It's not actually resolving anything. So even when I was there, really what they called counseling was just acknowledging that you're depressed and writing you a prescription for a psychotropic drug. And this compounded the problem for many people who had come into the system for drug addiction in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Then they come in and now they're addicted to the drug they're being prescribed here.
Mm-hmm. So Maud asked, what changes do you advise in schools and prisons?
I think that emotional health counseling, even if we want to expand it to mental health counseling, and you would have to, have people specifically trained for that. But for this type of trauma resolution, you don't need to be a psychologist. You don't need to be a psychiatrist. What we need is people who are trained in trauma resolution methods. So they should be integral parts of any institution. They should be integral parts of school, just like you have a school nurse. They should be integral parts of school. They should be integral parts of any counseling, domestic violence, any homeless shelter, anything where you have people where you're trying to get them to restart their life. I feel like these people who are trained in trauma resolution, who don't have to be doctors, should be an integral part of that program. And there should be funding and support for that. But of course, they do have to be trained in the protocols. I didn't have to be trained to work on myself, but to work on somebody else officially, there are certifications for it. But I could put somebody through the protocol, one-on-one, but there are certifications even that you can just get. As a trauma resolution expert, there are various protocols. And once you get it, this should just be as common as a school nurse.
Mm-hmm. Latina asks, are these issues exacerbated by the prevalence of private for-profit prisons?
Oh, absolutely. Because in the for-profit prisons, there's not even a pretense of counseling. They're just warehouses. In the state, they will at least put up a good show of having a counselor. In the for-profit prisons, they don't even bother. You're warehoused, and when you go, even when I left Dwight Correctional Center, my sister picked me up, as I was walking out, the guard said, "See you later." I said, "No, you won't." But the whole expectation is you'll be back. And the for-profit prisons don't even make a pretense of not expecting that. They're just warehouses.
Any other questions for Lisa?
So I hope that, people will find the book inspirational and informative, but really my goal, my hope is that it would just start more of a conversation about how can we really get this going on a local level. There are many things that if it's going to be done, it's just going to be done by us. It's going to be individuals recognizing the problem who can come together and come up with a solution. And what I really have is a program that I want to start a pilot program for, to show that it works. I was working with a man called Eric Fury, and he did this program and showed that it worked. He presented it to Congress and everything, but he was working with traumatized veterans to show that tapping actually worked with veterans who were in serious states of PTSD from combat. And so they did a 5-day intensive tapping workshop with them, and then followed them over the next 2 years and showed that the results of the tapping had lasted. And his program is a DVD called Emotional Freedom, The Answer. And so I was actually going to work with Eric to expand what he had done for veterans with prisoners. And he was all excited to do it. And, we had it all going, and then he died.
Mm.
And so I am trying now to just get that program done, just as he had done it with veterans, but still run the program to show if it can work for veterans who had been in combat, and they had come back totally traumatized. And after 5 days of tapping, an intensive workshop, they demonstrated that their results lasted over a 2-year period that they followed them on film. Tapping works. And so I said, if it can work for those veterans, and then I showed that it can work for me, I really want to, I am pitching a program currently to the state and to the Department of Corrections in various states to just fund a 5-day program for us to show that it works. And then from there, we can take it nationally. So that's what I'm actually trying to do. Get the program funded and run a pilot program, follow people and prove that it works. You know, because people want you to show them. But we can't, he showed that it works with veterans. And so I want to show that using the same protocol, it would work with anybody else. But I want to start with former prisoners.
Great.
I see somebody in the chat saying the Legislative Action Committee can address it more. Okay. Well, we can follow up with a conversation. Okay, yeah. I mean, all we can do is each person do our little share. But yeah, that's what I'm working on. That so to, you know, you gotta have the program and the stats. But I know we can do it because it's been done once in one community. And you know, it's no joke when you're working with combat veterans with PTSD. It worked for them. So I want to show that that same protocol can work for restored citizens.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Just awesome. Anyone else? Any other questions?
Karen.
I just had a comment. Lisa, I want to just say how much I admire your courage for writing this book in such intimate detail about your life and experiences. I mean, it was grueling to read. And when I think of all the people who don't have your intellectual capabilities and the fact that your mother started you reading at a young age, even though she controlled your reading for so many years, that you had that literacy, as you said, to investigate and explore and network with people inside and out of prison to help you self-heal.
Yeah.
You know, and how many hundreds of thousands of people don't have that capability.
Right.
So thank you so much. It is extremely enlightening.
Thank you. Yeah.
And we have to figure out how to get this process of dealing with trauma, because I mean, how many sexual assault cases have we heard, and you know, the pedophilia and everything out there, and those people are all in the same boat.
Exactly. Right.
So thanks again.
Thank you, Karen.
And the book is available in the Westminster tattered cover.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa.
No, I was going to say I had an event at Tattered Cover, and yeah, that was one of the places where someone came and she actually started sharing a story about a rape she had experienced decades ago, and she still had nightmares, you know. And so trauma is trauma. Mine came from my experiences, but the solution is applicable to whatever type of trauma you have. And in whatever type of prison you've been in. It may not have had barbed wire, but if your prison was behind your front door, it's still a prison.
Lisa, I think what you're doing is the most direct and concrete route from the League of Women Voters standpoint of policy. It seems like we could advocate that there should be training for social workers in schools, for prisons to recognize trauma and implement trauma, healing, so that we could reduce the recidivism rate. I think you could make a case that it would pay for itself.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it costs on the small end of what it's estimated, it costs $50,000 to incarcerate one person for 1 year. $50,000. Imagine what we could do with $50,000. And, you know, if we're just taking one neighborhood, and putting trained trauma in people to resolve this issue in one neighborhood. You wouldn't need $50,000 to do that. $50,000 taxpayers are spending every year to incarcerate each individual there and getting really nothing for your money. You know, I always tell people, if we had an airplane and 70% of them fell out of the sky, would you keep flying them? You know, we've got a 70% recidivism rate, and the taxpayers are still paying for that. You're not getting your money's worth. So this is really not just a bleeding heart, do good liberal thing. This is really an economic issue. You know, for taxpayers, this is a complete waste of your money, and you're not getting anything for it if there's a 70% failure rate. So yeah, I'm happy to work with the league on any issue related to that, and to tell my story or go testify or whatever, because I really could make the case that it's not just, you know, it's not a liberal issue, it's not a conservative issue. This is an issue for society.
Yeah.
Not only is it economic, it's public safety, it's public health. It is not in anybody's best interest to have people coming out and they're this damaged, and they're 70% likely to go back in, and you pay for it all over again. And that doesn't include whatever crime they committed on you while they were out here.
Mm-hmm.
This is everybody's problem. And so I'm happy to work with anybody who, you know, wants to recognize that and work on it.
Right. Well, thank you, Lisa. Wow, this was really powerful, really inspirational. As you said, it worked.
Thank you.
So,
So, you know, if any of you want to contact you want here, have my email address, but anybody, Beth, anybody needs my email, I see yours, Maud. I'm happy to talk about anything. If anybody wants to have a next step or something to testify on or whatever, just email me, get it from Beth or whatever.
right.
Yeah, because I really want to start a conversation about this, not just to have people say, yay, you, but okay, how do we actually fix it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one small way that was fixed, small, back in May of 2019 was that people who are no longer incarcerated but on parole received voting rights in Colorado again. So that was House Bill HB 1266. Just last month, I registered a former felon to vote. Well, actually, and he said to me, "I'm a felon," and I'm like, "Not anymore. You're not. You're out."
Right.
and we both cried when we registered him to vote, and it was lovely. So,
and the challenge to that is getting more people to know that.
exactly.
Because, you know, in some prisons, they're still telling people they can't vote.
Yep.
They're giving them false information. So, yeah.
Yeah. And Lisa, we are actually working with the DC League to identify DC prisoners within Colorado, because DC just passed to allow actively serving felons to vote.
Oh, yeah.
So looking for DC felons here in Colorado prisons to get in there and help them to vote.
Yeah.
But anything else the league can do, we look forward to partnering with you. And really, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Maud, will you email me?
If Beth can share your email with me, or if you want to snag my email out of the chat.
Lisa put hers in the chat too.
Oh, she did. She did. Okay, then I'll save the chat.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
I appreciate you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Lisa.
Bye-bye.
Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Yep. And Beth, congrats on your being fully staffed.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. It was a good first day.
Good.
Okay. Take care, everybody. Nice to see you, Peggy.